Hello and welcome to the Cuyamungue Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute. And along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And on behalf of our Board of Directors, our advisors, our volunteers, and supporting members, we do want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamungue Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness in the human experience, following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist, Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And as we continue, our focus is reflected in three main areas: experience, education, and exploration. We respect the path of academic balance, the creative pursuit of science, while advancing, conserving, and restoring a direct experience of the deeper human connection to all of life. It's part of our mission to expand our own experiential research with the multidisciplinary understanding that is available to us today. And as an educational institution, we take a very open approach and invite scholars in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. And that's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. And on these weekly Sunday discussions, we've had a full spectrum of topics from the arts to the sciences and so much more. There's probably a couple hundred presentations online available to you, both either as a webcast or as a podcast. And we invite you to visit our website at CuyamungueInstitute.com. All these presentations are free, and it's a nonprofit. Of course, we invite you to become a supporting member, join our inner circle, and we want to thank you, the community members who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamungue Institute. Today, we continue to examine the evolution of our collective worldviews, that meeting point of science and spirit. Some define our modern age as one where objective science has pushed out any beliefs in myths, in magic, and the unexplained. Well, our guest today notes that historically, and contrary to popular belief, attempts to suppress the mysteries have mostly failed, even within the sciences. In fact, the idea that people don't believe in magic or spirits has been disproven almost every day. According to several surveys, the majority of people living in Europe and the Americas believe in ghosts and psychic type of powers and magic and the mysteries. So what drives this divide between science and spirituality, and how can we find harmony between our lived experiences, our personal and collective worldviews?
Indeed, Paul. So many of us hold to a worldview that can embrace the mysteries, whether we're looking to the leading edge of science that's examining the very substrata of the stuff that makes up the universe, and finding that the closer we peer into it, the more we find that there is no there, where the most celebrated scientists from Max Planck to Einstein considered themselves mystics, where we seek to find harmony at this meeting point of the sciences, our worldview, the mysteries, our lived experience, because so many of us walk in both worlds. And I find that one of the conundrums is sorting out the evolution of our collective worldviews with language, the baggage that comes with most of the terms that we use. I want to point out that the term spirit, that which fills us up with moments of awe and wonder and gratitude and this universal love for all of life, we're all familiar with that state. We call that spirit. And that's quite different from the term spirits, plural, disincarnate, lost souls or ghosts. And the word magic can denote stage magic and its illusions, or it can refer to magical thinking, wishful thinking. Spelled with a K at the end, it's referring to spells and witchcraft, or it can be an homage to a wondrous universe replete with mysteries beyond what we ourselves can fathom. As in, I like this phrase, the goddess is alive and magic is afoot.
Yeah.
So we'll be asking our guests to define the terms as you use them as we delve into what exactly is in our worldview, how has it evolved? And we're only looking at Western civilization, right? We're not even talking about most of what we research as the early societies and their experience. But, I've long wondered why Newton's research into alchemy and astrology has been disassociated with his foundational work on physics. He's been rather sanitized of his mystical leanings. And indeed, our guest has examined several of the scientists who were also mystics. It's common knowledge that Marie and Pierre Curie filled an important piece of the electromagnetic spectrum with X-rays, but not that they were researching mediums and seances, or that Freud seriously investigated telepathy. So I don't know, don't we have to take these people in their full package and say, you know, they put serious investigation to some of these mysteries, as humankind has been doing so since the get-go, right? We've long been grappling with these mysteries because they impact how we experience the world. Our guest today, he wrote The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of Human Sciences, to explore what he calls the very theorists of modernity and their belief that disenchantment was how they worked out their various insights. But they did so inside a world overflowing with spirits and magic. He's exploring this connection to the human sciences and esotericism, and why he says the notion of an enchanted world is a necessary victim of modernity. Jason Josephson-Storm, he teaches at Williams College, where he's the chair and associate professor of religion, and he leads an interesting life. He notes that he's worked for a private investigator. He's been a Buddhist monk. I think he's still a Buddhist. He hiked a volcano off the coast of Africa. He's been shot at and jumped by a gang in Amsterdam, snowboarded in the Pyrenees. He's played bass guitar in a punk band, and he almost died from scarlet fever. But what we find most interesting is that he's the grandson of anthropologist Dr. Felicitas D. Goodman. She's the late founder of the Cuyamungue Institute, this very institute that Paul and I direct and helm. And so we welcome you, Jason. Thanks for being here with us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. This is fun. Yeah, I'm especially thrilled to be walking in my grandmother's footsteps here to talk to you all. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, indeed. So she must have been a big influence on you growing up and your whole family.
Yeah, definitely. And on me in particular, I think, so my parents are both academics as well, and they would often leave me with my grandmother for extended periods while they were doing, their own kind of research or work or writing. And so I spent a good chunk of my childhood with my grandmother. I was closer to her than really any of my other grandparents, and she was just a real role model. She told fabulous stories that she, had been folk tales from different cultures, and she was just really just a very brilliant and engaged person. And so really one of the reasons that I became inspired to study belief systems, religion, quote unquote, more broadly was really under her influence. Yeah, definitely.
Well, she would have interesting folks show up at the Institute in Santa Fe on a regular basis. So you must have sat in a lot of conversations that inspired you. And
yeah, definitely. I think it gave me a good introduction to anthropology. And I think for me, I ended up doing more historical research, but that kind of anthropological ability to see different cultures, to contrast them, to develop a kind of understanding that isn't just parochially limited to just one culture, that was really under her influence too. And then she also had known a lot of famous thinkers in one way or another. And sometimes I got to meet some of them or got to hear her stories about, she had, knew who, or gone to lectures by Heidegger, and she told me about that. Or she knew Mircea Eliade, who was a big deal in the 70s and 80s. And she told me, stuff about her interactions with him and, things like that, that really gave me the idea that I could, aspiration to engage in these upper level conversations. And so by the time I was in college and then graduate school, I put myself out there and, learned from a lot of different folk.
She also spoke and wrote 8 languages. And I understand you have a number of languages as well. So this just comes naturally to your family, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a genetic or cultural thing, but at least for me anyway, yeah, I read 10 languages. And I think she was an early influence. I think it also helped that I was put in bilingual schools from a young age. And so once you get a second language, it becomes easier to get another one and then, to accumulate them. But Yeah, but my grandmother was really fabulous around languages. And even after she had the stroke at the latter part of her life that really debilitated her in different ways, if you would talk to her in a language, she would just respond instinctively in that language, and, almost unaccented, I mean, the languages that I talked to her in, but, really fabulous and very deep capacity. And I was fortunate enough to maybe either inherit that or be inspired by her example enough to continue pursuing languages. So it's definitely a real pleasure of mine. Yeah.
Well, I also wanted to say that you also are your own researcher, your own path of knowledge. And I know that she'd be very proud of all that you've accomplished and what you've done. And I've been going through some of your publications this week, taking a look at the work that you've been doing. And it's just, some of it's just astounding. And we'll look so forward to today's conversation and getting into, we're choosing one specific area of research, but your work is pretty broad and
Tell us
profound.
the scope of what your quest is. What is your personal quest?
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to start.
What are the questions that you're trying to unravel?
I think what I'm really interested in is basically philosophy and history and how they fit together. And then I'm trying to use those kind of disciplinary backgrounds to call into question things that people have taken for granted, but that might not actually be the case, like ideas about modernity, or ideas about what meaning means, or ideas about science and what the best way to understand science is. I tend to be, unlike some of my peers who tend to be territory driven, they tend to, I don't know, stake out, the life of Oliver Cromwell, and then all their publications are about Cromwell or something. I tend to be question driven. And so I tend to have different research questions, and then I go out there and try and figure them out. And I've tended gone into research questions that required or different language work. And so one of the things that I really love to do is to really get immersed in a different language and culture, to do archival research in different places, and then try and answer these kind of big questions about not just what makes us human, but also what makes us human in relationship to a rich multi-species environment that we live in. And how do we understand things? What is meaning? How should we understand history and its broader trajectories, things like that. But officially, I have 3 areas of professional specialization: East Asian philosophical thought, so Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism. Second, European intellectual history, so especially French and German philosophy. And then third, I do a kind of history and philosophy of science. And so that's a big background. And then with a subspecialization of especially focused on the history of the humanities and social sciences, and their dialogue with the natural sciences, let's say. So how they either fit or don't fit into the categories of, way that people define science in different points.
Well, join us, because we're examining our worldview and its evolution too. So interesting. You ended up, as you describe yourself, an agnostic Buddhist. How did you arrive at that description? And what was the path that led you?
Yeah, I would say my parents are both Buddhists. So I grew up with Buddhism as a background tradition, and my father's family are Jews. And so I also grew up with a Jewish culture. I would say that wasn't drawn toward theisms, but you can't rule anything out. So that's the other piece of that. But the particular Buddhism that I practiced briefly as a monk and then as a lay Buddhist is a kind of Zen Buddhism, which is very austere, very stripped down, but I try not to be closed-minded. And so if there's a hedge around it, I'm just pretty open. I don't think that I have the hubris to try and disabuse people of other people's, fundamental beliefs. And I have a certain humility toward categories like the divine or what have you. But personally, Zen and a kind of very stripped down, the Japanese formulation is Hihan Bukkyo. So a kind of critical Buddhism, but also Buddhism as criticism. So it's a Buddhism that I see as part of my Buddhist practice, not believing in things that are, they're not true. I would use a word that would be a cuss word, but I won't use it on
You're an
air.
explorer, like
I'm an explorer, right? Exactly, an explorer with a strong belief in intellectual humility. Yeah.
So the myth of disenchantment. So it was Max Weber who coined this disenchantment, the world of disenchantment. The world is Tell us about that phrase and what led you to start investigating.
Yeah, so the German sociologist Max Weber, writing about 100 years ago, actually, basically in the teens, actually, so a little more than 100 years ago, Max Weber Coined basically or adapted a famous a phrase, a kind of poetic description of the grand trajectory of human history, and that phrase was die Entzauberung der Welt, so the literally de-magicking of the world. And this phrase Weber described, well, we could talk about what Weber really meant by it, but it took on a new life in American sociology in the 20s and 30s under the influence of a particular thinker named Talcott Parsons. And Parsons translated it as the disenchantment of the world, and spread by Parsons and then by various folks in Germany, particularly Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. That phrase took on its own life, this idea that the world was disenchanted. This was taken to mean that the central feature of modernity was that people no longer believed in magic, spirits, or myths anymore, and that was going to be a progressive phenomenon. It wasn't exactly what Weber had meant by the original phrase, but like a lot of these things, there's a phrase that becomes popular and takes on its own life. And so this anchored a broad, sociological understanding of human knowledge and what was supposed to make the modern world different from the quote unquote pre-modern world. And it was also geographically spatialized. So people thought that the world of disenchantment was the modern West, and then they already kind of began to hedge the conversation around places like the East Asia or South America or Africa already were sort of excluded from this category, the way that it was spatialized. And there were many other secondary elaborations. That phrase, Weber wasn't writing out of nowhere, and he was drawing on a larger body of work. But if you ask a lot of people, they have the idea that one of the central features of modernity is that people don't believe in spirits, magic, or myth anymore, that those things are archaic. And they also tend to have the idea that, and they use this phrase sometimes, that the current moment is disenchanted or despiritualized, that moderns supposedly have lost or rejected a nature full of vibrant living spirits or animated entities in favor of a kind of austere mechanism, which, a kind of more stripped down belief that everything is just deterministic movement of particles in the void. And I wonder,
God has died and left the universe,
right,
and it's a cold dead machine that's running down, right, and then poof.
Yeah, exactly. And so even there, you already gestured to a phrase made popular by Friedrich Nietzsche, "God is dead," which was one of the influences on Weber. He was a reader of Nietzsche. The phrase goes back earlier than Nietzsche, but Nietzsche is the one that gets the credit for it because he's a popular philosopher. But yeah, exactly. So that idea. So I wanted to know, how do we get that idea? Like, actually, and I could tell you a little bit more specifically about how I came to it, but that's the idea that I'm questioning in the book, just to foreshadow where I'm going with this.
What are the statistics about who believes what? And you're talking about just Western, you're talking about our Western world. So what are the stats in terms of who adheres to a religion, who declares that they're spiritually oriented, who declares that they believe in this, that, and the other?
So I mean, there's a range of sociological evidence, and you can, so there are a series of rounds of surveys. Basically, Gallup did a set of them. There's also a Baylor sociological survey, both of these from, about a decade old at this point. And, I don't have them in front of me to give you the exact numbers, but I can give you a sense of the categories. So there are two things that we want to disaggregate as a phenomenon, which are church attendance, which is quite fluctuating and by many measures has gone down. So this is what people sometimes call secularization. But then the second thing is belief. And so if you look at belief numbers, many Americans and many people living in Western Europe believe in psychic powers, haunted houses, ghosts, telepathy, clairvoyance, extraterrestrials, necromancy, demons, witches, channeling, etc. And if you look at those numbers, it looks like if you aggregate them together, about 75% of Americans, for instance, have some kind of paranormal belief. Paranormal is was the Baylor term for each of these belief categories. So about 75% of Americans have paranormal beliefs. About 90% of Americans believe in God. But if you go to Western Europe, for instance, if you look at England, only a bare majority believe in God, according to similar surveys. So about 51% of Britons, and church attendance is way lower in Britain than the United States. But similar numbers of Britons believe in all the paranormal categories. And there is some evidence, if you look at these survey data across temporally, that as church attendance goes down, belief in spirits and ghosts goes up. So what it looks like is a kind of de-Christianization doesn't, or like maybe deinstitutionalized Christianization doesn't lead toward a stripped down mechanistic cosmos, but leads toward a kind of plurality of beliefs and different kinds of, we could say, enchanted beliefs. And any given person might not have these beliefs cluster with different demographics. So, for instance, evangelical Christians are more likely to believe in the reality of demonic possession. People who are have college degrees are less likely to believe in the reality of demonic possession, but more likely to believe in the reality of ghosts. Again, there are different kinds of correlates, and we could look at correlates by gender or by race or ethnicity or by religious affiliation, and I could say a little bit more here or there. But the broad picture is that most people in the contemporary quote-unquote West believe in ghosts or something analogous, spirits, and some kind of magic or psychic powers.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Why do you,
Paranormal.
to what do you
Paranormal.
attribute that?
Yeah.
Due to direct experience? It's more
what
fun to
I'm
believe
more-
that way. What do you attribute it to?
Well, so in the book, what I was mostly trying to do was undercut a counter theory. A lot of time had been spent by a whole raft of scholars trying to explain why people didn't believe in these beliefs anymore. So, I mean, the presumption was that people, by the vast majority of sociologists and psychologists studying human belief patterns, many of them were attempts to explain why disenchantment occurred. So the first step is to realize that disenchantment didn't occur. And so then the second question is, why didn't it? And I don't think that there's one univocal answer, but I think I want to say that there are a couple of different things going on. One of them is that the beliefs are not archaic holdovers. So the idea that somebody who believes in ghosts in the 21st century believes the same things as, say, a medieval European who believed in ghosts, not really. The term might be consistent, but what the actual content of that term has shifted and changed, for instance.
Yeah. Even in Buddhism, there are spirits, right? It's founded on a belief in spirits, even in Buddhism. Now, I don't know how active that is, but it's historically there.
A lot of it depends on how you define certain categories. So I think normatively, historically, a lot of the Buddhist scriptures are kind of agnostic around spirits. I mean, there are different ways to put it. They take for granted a background cosmology that we might call a Hindu cosmology, but they're not mostly interested in that cosmology. There are definitely those threads within Buddhism, and I would say probably the majority of living Buddhists who have room for a category like Deva, if you're talking in Sanskrit, or Kami, if you're talking in Japanese, which are not 100% identical categories, but might include gods of different sorts. Now, whether those are the same things as spirits or not is a little bit tricky, and how they fit into the cosmology. In Buddhism, it's one of the realms of rebirth. And anyway, it has different kinds of features. We could talk about it a little bit more.
You could
but
just say there's mysteries. Mysteries are there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
The universe is more than what you see is what you get.
Yeah, I would say that it tends to be an orientation. Yeah, there are different ways to describe it, for sure. I think at the very least, it isn't the austere mechanism that people have associated with a kind of stripped down science. And at the very least, even in Buddhism's more stripped down varieties, like my own Zen background, it tends to make open different kinds of ways of relating to the world. Yeah, I would say that.
So interestingly, you had a sabbatical. You decided to use it to go and start researching down into these scientist mystics of 100 years ago. So tell us how you did that. There
were a few more steps in the middle. So I had finished my first book at that time, and I was on sabbatical. And I was in Japan researching a second book about Japan, which I didn't end up writing, but published in some articles. And what I was looking at was contemporary Japanese belief in talismans. What I was interested in is like sort of techno magic and how those co-occurred in contemporary Japan. So particularly rituals for a deity that was supposed to be the god of astronauts, flash drives that were supposed to be protect your computer from viruses, but also were talismanic and were supposed to prevent spirits from messing with your hard drive, that kind of thing. Anyway, I was doing that kind of research. And while I was there, I was there during the tsunami and Fukushima disaster in 2011 when I was doing the Japanese research. And it just seemed like the kind of ethnographic work I was planning on doing, people had a lot more important things to do with their lives than talk to me about those beliefs, because they had just, I mean, I was there when the disaster unfolded. And, after I made sure that my friends and colleagues were safe, I was like, I should probably relocate. And so I ended up being able, for various reasons, to relocate to Germany. And so instead, what I started thinking about, and to take a little even more of a step back, even the day that the Fukushima disaster happened, or the tsunami happened, I was in a tattoo parlor getting some additional ink done. And I was talking to some people at the tattoo parlor as part of my ethnography. They were like, why are you in Japan? And I was telling them in Japanese about the research project. And there was one European dude somebody from Scandinavia. I never figured out whether it was, which Scandinavian country he was from. And when he heard me talking about my research, he was like, oh, that's just like mysterious Asia. That's stuff that Asians believe in. But in Europe, nobody believes in spirits. Nobody believes in, alternate realities or myths or anything like that anymore. And I knew that that was false. Part because of my experiences with my grandmother and the people that had wandered through, but also, from a lifetime of being attentive to these kind of unusual belief systems that people have. And so I thought, maybe the best way to undo this presuppositions about the relationship between technology or science and belief is not to focus on Japan for a second book, but to focus on Western Europe. So I relocated to Germany. And then what I did was an extensive period of archival research, looking at the writings of, I was especially focused on people who were themselves the main theorists of disenchantment, the famous people who argued that modernity itself meant an end of belief in spirits and ghosts. And what I did was go through archives, look at their diaries, look at their letters, look at personal things that they left behind. And I sort of was interested in how these magical beliefs basically entered their lives. And in particular, because the timing of it is that a lot of these theories originate in broadly the same period in which Western Europe had a boom in spiritualism. So table turning and seances, when it was in the middle of occult revivals and the groups like the Golden Dawn and the Theosophical Society. And so I was interested in how that came into the lives of the theorists of quote unquote disenchantment. And then I extended it to various influential scientists that were part of that conversation. I ended up doing archival work in a range of Western European countries. And then I made a trip back to go to England and do some more work at the Trinity Archive in Cambridge, England. But all told, I was able to show how the very theorists of disenchantment were themselves often engaged in, broadly speaking, the very things that they were describing, enchantment. And so, for instance, E.B. Tyler, who was one of the first theorists to use the term animism as a description of a cultural category for indigenous peoples, let's say. He himself was interested in seances, and he defines animism as belief in spirits. And then in his personal life, although he didn't publish this during his lifetime, he went to seances, and he was interested in the spirits that were conjured up in the mediumistic circles. And so in that way, according to his own strict definition, his fellow Victorians should have been the animists, not the indigenous people around whom he was writing, and frankly, around whhom he didn't have that much direct knowledge. He had some, but he had done some field work, but not zero, but he wasn't, deeply embedded. So anyway, so that's, for instance, one of the thinkers I depart from in the book. And then in the book, I ended up going back to research basically from a moment we could call the scientific revolution up to the mid 20th century, and tracing, different versions, because it gets tied up in the myth about what science is and what science does, who is a scientist, what beliefs are licensed by science, but even more importantly, what are the cultural impacts of scientific belief, which are often distinct from what any given scientist believes in any given moment. So the sort of the image of science itself. And for those really geeky people in the audience who may or may not be here, the book is all shadow boxing in a way with a very, very influential and informative, really important work of philosophy, Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I kind of dance with them throughout the whole book, and then conclude with them in certain respects. So if that means anything to anyone, probably not. Anyway, that's maybe a little inside baseball there. A lot of rich and interesting stuff. Yeah.
So tell us about some of the various scientists. You talk a lot about Madame Curie. When her husband died, she wanted, unexpectedly and too young, she was doing seances to talk to him. But he also was interested in this psychical stuff. So can you just outline some of those scientists and what they were doing?
Yeah, so I
And why
start the
they were
book with
sanitized, basically.
yeah. So I start the book with Marie Curie, and note that she was part of a group. So very I probably don't need to introduce Marie Curie, sort of the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, one of the first people to ever win 2 different Nobel Prizes in different disciplines, absolutely fabulous scientist who had to fight against a significant sexism of her own particular period, even to get any of her work done, really groundbreaking and influential person. And then one of the interesting things that happened is it basically right around the dawn of the 20th century, a group of France's most, I don't know, elite thinkers got together to try and figure out the reality of spirit mediums. And in particular, they were interested in a woman named Eusapia Palladino, who had traveled, who could do physical materialization. She was supposed to be able to make lights appear, to make objects move. So kind of what we would think of as kind of psychic powers, but she also channeled a spirit she called John King, and would, relay things from the realm of the ghosts. And Marie Curie and her husband were both interested in it, and also famous people, including the philosopher Henri Bergson and a bunch of other French physicists from the period, all engaged in these research seances, basically, with Palladino. And Marie Curie became convinced that both Pierre and Marie became convinced that there was something really there. Marie Curie writes about seeing these like lights that appeared in the complete darkness that Eusapia was able to kind of summon into existence. And so they were, anyway, so that I begin the book with that moment, which shouldn't seem weird, except that it's the co-occurrence of science and seance in the same room. And some people might be bothered by that, but it turns out if you look at the history of many of the, most influential scientists of the last few decades, few hundred years, there are different kinds of engagement with, complex, beliefs, paranormal, spiritual, etc. So why does it get sanitized? Well, partially it gets sanitized for different reasons. In the post 50s, after the 1950s, there became a new narrative about the Second World War that assumed that what made the Nazis particularly bad was that they were occultists. And so you get the occult Nazi trope. And it turns out there were a couple Nazis who were occultists, but it wasn't, not only was it not the majority, most Nazis, Hitler's actual project was what he called positive Christianity, which was a anti-Semitic version of Christianity. They actually prevented various people, closed various occult or institutions, shut down Freemasonry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a good historical description of the Nazis, but it became like a popular trope. It appears in novels, in Pulp Fiction. It occurs in Indiana Jones, first Indiana Jones movie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's still a widely repeated myth by non-specialists who think that that's what was defining for the Nazis. But this is association of fascism and magical beliefs made it seem even more dangerous to have those kind of belief systems. Today, we know that magical beliefs, let's say, occur on both sides of the political spectrum or all across the political spectrum.
Oh, yeah.
It's not politically tagged, even though there may be political differences on specifically which one. So part of it is that, but part of it is also more fundamentally, there's a longer history with this notion about modernity and the way that disciplines were formulated to make somebody seem modern or rational. The idea was it was incompatible with holding, let's say, superstitious beliefs. And so when people were writing the biographies of founders, when it's like when Jones is writing his biography of Freud, he goes back in and he wants to suppress the stuff about Freud that might seem embarrassing. And so he doesn't completely exclude, but largely excludes Freud's own interest in telepathy and whatever. That kind of thing. So you have that pattern, and and so that goes back quite some ways. There are other reasons I could go into more detail, but those are two of the most.
Well, it was surprising to us when we were having our guest Helena Dirkstra, who made a documentary film about Hilma af Klint. She was saying how even today, her association with Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy and all of that, I mean, she lived also 100 years ago. And so this has been suppressed by the very museums that are now celebrating her artwork. They don't really mention that part of it. right? They'd go, yeah, she just was spiritually painting these glorious, big, huge paintings, and she was making diaries of her visionary experiences. But the museums themselves, she was saying, don't include, that she was channeling, that she was looking deeply in meditative practices. So it even goes across the arts, is my point.
Oh yeah, there's a
that.
lot. I mean, I think if you look at the history of the fine arts, for instance, there's a strong association between theosophy in particular and modernism, early modernism. If you go, but also other movements. So the surrealists were often interested in magic and esoteric traditions. We have. For instance, also, symbolism was connected to occult revivals. Like, these patterns, reappear, and you get them often, sometimes in individual biographies. So already since the, let's say, late 90s, people had been excavating key details of individual thinkers and maybe writing little things about them. So, for instance, a book about Newton's occult, there have been now a couple books about Newton's occult practices or alchemical practices, for instance. But they tended to not tie, but they're always presented as the exception. So it would be like, okay, Newton was the last magician.
For this, but he was also
they're like, well, even if they're celebrating him, they were like Newton as the last magician. And then you get the idea that it all stopped with him. Even, I mean, that's literally the title of one of those books, or quite close to it. And, that book celebrated him as, for having those kind of magical thoughts, but figured that they had stopped after Newton sometime after the study was done. But actually, if you look a little bit longer, these kinds of patterns reoccur. And so one of the things I was also doing was kind of taking advantage of some of those isolated studies and providing new evidence and providing a broader trajectory that made things seem much less weird than, because actually, basically the history is less homogenous than people have historically presented it as. And so part of that's part of what's going on too. And I'll say that
we haven't even mentioned consciousness, right? Because that's another meeting point where the leading edge of science and physics and quantum physics and experimental, all that, really is looking at consciousness as a substrate of the universe. We haven't even talked about that. So, and it's interesting how when you really look at some of the quotes of Planck and Einstein, they were mystics. They were saying there's mysteries here that we can't quite grapple at. There's more to the world than this physical reality. I mean, that's another part of the belief system among many as well. Huge debates on that. And even Wikipedia, famously, we were talking with Dean Radin, and he was saying, Wikipedia is like doing a hatchet job on me because I am investigating paranormal phenomenon in a scientific way, putting science to it, finding some statistical evidence for it, using the scientific method. You can be a scientist and employ the scientific method and still look at, and often if you go where the evidence leads, find that there's something beyond what our scientific instruments can detect, where we can detect it, but our scientific instruments cannot. So, I mean, that's another realm. It's not just ghosts and such. I mean, there's a broader sense of mystery here that science is grappling with. That's truly spiritual. So it's interesting. So my own position is we can't explain it away because we keep experiencing it, right? We experience beyond what science itself can verify. We don't need just the scientific good housekeeping seal of approval to limit our own beliefs. We must, each of us, seek a worldview that encompasses what we truly experience, or you have to chalk it up and say you're crazy. We can't trust our own senses. That's an untenable position.
We can't dismiss 10,000s of years of indigenous cultures who have had these types of belief systems and experiences.
So what is the conclusion of your book? What is this journey?
So first, modernity, as it's often understood, is a myth. That there's not a profound rupture between in a clear linear way. You might say there are a series of micro ruptures, but there's no single decisive modern rupture. I'm not describing stasis. I'm interested in how these beliefs have changed, but there's this myth that there's a moment where everybody became rational somehow, and or some people became rational, and with a very narrow versions of how rationalism is defined and understood. So first, modernity is a myth. Second, disenchantment is a myth. So the idea that that the central trajectory of the last 200 or 250 years, or arguably, from Weber's account all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, has been a stripping away of belief in spirits, is not the case. Now, it's true that there have been some ups and downs, and I don't want to describe total stasis. And one might note that what specific beliefs people have believed have changed quite significantly. So, but it's not, anyway, disenchantment is kind of a myth. More also, another key finding of the book is that I'm also interested in the history of the idea that religion and science are in conflict, and I historicize that in the very birth of the notion of categories, religion and science. They were defined in certain kinds of opposition basically in the starting most significantly in the 19th century, so not really much earlier than that. But then they were back projected. A conflict between religion and science was back projected onto the past, along with other similar kinds of myths, like the myth that I don't know, the Catholic Church killed were mad at Galileo because of his scientific beliefs, not because of his what they thought was his unorthodox theology, or the idea that people thought that the world was flat before Columbus proved that the world was a globe. I mean, there are all these sort of weird myths that were there, that were invented in the 19th century to bolster a presupposition that science and religion were in opposition or conflict. And in the very moment that they were defined in opposition or conflict, people already from that moment, people kept trying to cross them or merge them in different ways. So you have proliferations of quote unquote religions of science, or scientific or a kind of terrain of the occult, which were often described as magical intersections between religion and science, or pseudosciences and what have you. And then also that there's not necessarily stable content in the categories religion and science. So it's not just that belief in spirits changes over time, but how science is defined. There's not a unitary ahistorical scientific method. There's not a univocal notion of what the term religion means and what it should include, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of it. And then, fundamentally deep down, I think there was this presupposition that the era of stories was done, that we no longer had grand narratives. And I think that human thinking is, broadly speaking, narrative, or, built in human consciousness is in that kind of format. So, I mean, those are some of the conclusions. There are also a lot of more specific ones. Fun stuff that I found in the archive about, Francis Bacon, supposed founder of the father of the scientific method. And he's often supposed to have said knowledge is power, but he didn't really said that. He said knowledge is God's power. And so, it takes on a very different resonance when you drop pieces of it and mistranslate it from the Latin, or, translate out of context, that snippet out of context, or, little things here or there, things about how retroactively a notion of a time period called the Enlightenment was formulated. And then people got into the idea that there was a grand epoch of enlightenment, and that they could kind of no true Scotsman fallacy about include random French people in, and French dudes mostly in, and exclude other random people. Or anyway, a lot of that kind of historical work.
It's ironic that those who want to dispel the notion that we rely on stories or myths are spinning the very stories and myths that they're using to get across their point. It's interesting, a little bit ironic. I want to hear from Tony before he has to leave, because here is a scientist who's also a mystic. So he's
Thank you. I was not quite ready for this, but this is really exciting. The categories that Jason, you're talking about are things that might be codified, where there may be definitions, and there are other things that are far more personal that happen. For example, tomorrow I give an invited talk to the American Astronomical Society. I was struggling on one theme where I will be challenged. I dreamed the solution last night, and I made a PowerPoint this morning. It came purely from that mode. That may be just that I've thought about it a lot, but it felt a little otherworldly, and I like that. Also, I seem to, and I'm not going to tell stories now, but I've had profound coincidences which cannot be, there's no scientific way I could discredit them. I can run Monte Carlo models and prove that there's no way that this could happen randomly. Yet it doesn't fit in any codification. It does not have anybody's exact definition of spirituality, but there is something otherworldly of it, which I like. And I thought maybe you might expand onto that some.
So in the first case, I mean, I think, talking about dreams, there's one of the side effects of a very narrow and artificial notion of rationality is the presupposition that intellectual discoveries come from, I don't know, like some kind of logic plus an aha moment. But if we look at the history of a number of important scientific insights, the DNA helix appeared first in a dream, for instance, famously. I know it's been a while since I looked at this literature, but there's a large literature about the way
We've
that,
discussed that. Yeah.
discoveries that came out of altered states of consciousness, whether those were dream states or quasi-sleep states or trance states,
We
or
could just chalk them up to
states.
altered
Yeah,
states.
yeah, right. Or chemically altered. I mean, it does, but there's a lot of, mix up, a lot of what generative ideas come from taking yourself out of the straitjacket of discursive thinking in some way or another. So I think there's a lot of evidence for that. Second, yeah, I think a lot of people's individual day-to-day practices don't fit cleanly into categories, and indeed, and experiences don't fit cleanly into categories. Like there's this weird idea that people are supposed to have self-consistent worldviews. This is also the psychology literature calls this presumes that if you have cognitive dissonance, you get unhappy, right? Like the idea is that why do people, this is based on sort of a famous sociology around people who believed in that the end of the world was going to happen. It didn't happen. Why didn't they stop believing the prophet who told them the end of the world? The solution is supposed to be people abhor cognitive dissonance. But I actually think in the contrary, I think cognitive consistency is very hard to achieve. It takes, a lot of serious thought, training, and practice. And in some cases, it may or may not be a good thing. And so, it depends on one's domain and what one's purpose or functions are. I think we tend to have, there are a lot more we could say about consciousness, about our experiences of the world, and the difficulty with presuppositions about clean categories. But I don't mean to take us on too much of a digression. Yeah.
So Tony, as a scientist,
Oh, go ahead, Laura. I'm sorry.
well, as a scientist, you use the scientific method, but you use additional tools to live your life as well.
Well, but when I present, it has to fit in the scientific method. This is a tool for communication. It doesn't mean that my world is governed that way. It means this is a filter I use, which means I can communicate. And it's something other than Tony thinks this. It's,
Thank you. Yeah.
This falls in because of this, and that.
There's also a lot of, in the philosophy of science literature, a distinction between context of discovery and context of justification. So, Tony can come to the insight by way of a dream, but when he wants to justify or explain that belief to other astronomers, he uses a different set of discursive strategies. There's also some great work on what people use arguments for. So I'm talking about the work of the French cognitive anthropologist Daniel Sperber, who notices that the way that reasoning functions, public reasoning is about group consensus behavior. So it's not anyway. There's a whole separate conversation there, but it's there's sort of discursive norms for how, and different communities have different kinds of epistemic norms about how knowledge is justified. So, what might count as justification for knowledge in an astronomy society would be a different kind of evidence than might count for justification, I don't know, for a claim of a different sort in a church setting, or might count it differently among, in an indigenous community or whatever. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Well, I love the idea of group consensus. I mean, that's a concept to work with. And in my phenomena that I experience are individual, and they come at me in different ways at different times in different circumstances, but they still come at me. There's no way I could codify it. There's no way I could say this fits in with this or that practice. They just sort of come. And an interesting experience I had a few years ago was making a presentation to a Mormon audience in St. George, Utah, of 600 on NASA's search for other worlds. And I was dealing with a spectrum of people there some were very modern in their appreciation of science. Some believed the Earth was formed 7,000 years ago, and they did not. So I had to kind of do that dance, but it was possible. It was possible to do it. And
we can always find some common ground.
Yeah, find some common ground. And I said, I'm trying to present things that are beyond my opinion. There are things where there are certain things that fall together that justify this. And I would ask you to do the same. I had only a couple of obnoxious questions. I was surprised, but for the most part, people seem to understand as long as I was not putting them down, they were not putting me down.
That's a
And I
good
think
point.
And I'm
I think
sure
we all
not
got
all
that
Mormons
right.
believe the same either. I mean,
No,
that's,
no. So no, I
yeah,
mean there's some excellent science done in the Mormon
yeah.
community, but there are a number of people that believe the Earth was found 7,000 years ago.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You know, and
Yeah.
literally, think of Adam and Eve and that progression. So it does get into interesting discussions.
And I appreciate how nuanced your work is, Jason, how you're saying there's not just one belief, it's a tapestry of multiple
Yeah,
threads here. Yeah. And it's we do ourselves a disservice to paint it with just one brushstroke.
And it brings
Yeah.
also the point up is that you're doing it from an independent point of view. You're not trying to sell some specific belief system. In fact, the opposite, where you're just saying,
Unravel
I'm
them
just
all.
unraveling what people believe. It's not my belief.
Yeah.
It's just that's
Yeah.
what's there.
More complexity than we give it credit for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the human story has to have some mystery to it. It has to have fun and excitement. And one of the things I like best about your grandmother was the ability that she could talk in the terminology and the
Yeah.
history from a way of not trying to sharpen it down to just the scientific facts, but allowing the joy of life itself to be expressed and the artistic expression that we find throughout civilizations around the world.
Well, you talk about the dream state and how much knowledge there is to be
Mhm.
pulled down from wherever it is. That, I mean, a lot of members in our community are real scientists who say, hey, we can go exploring in altered states, or the eternal now is one of her wonderful terms for this, but it doesn't, there's no belief system, there's no dogma associated, it's direct experience. So whether you want to microdose, as some people do, to get an expanded state, she's
Yeah.
saying it's naturally built within us. We can make a shift into
Yeah.
that quite easily, naturally. May not be
Yeah.
common, but you want to see what your dreams hold, you can access a waking dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you guys mentioned one thing, and that is my approach. Whether I'm doing science, whether I'm deciding what job to take, or even where I'm going to go for dinner, I always try and base this on feeling. I may go through a matrix of to look at the various facts, but at the end, I always do it by feeling, and that has almost always turned out to be the right thing to do. I just thought I would comment that as I leave.
Yeah. They
Thank
did
you.
a study on the most successful CEOs in business, and they said, I go up in my gut,
Yeah.
right? Intuition.
Use the term gut, it somehow makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Tony. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
We have a question from Elle.
Elle, sorry, not you, honey. Elle.
Hi, Elle.
Hi there. I just wanted to mention before Tony leaves that this gathering for me is actually a synchronistic event, because I am doing a presentation on Jason's thoughts and work, as well as his grandmother's, to a group of master's research students at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, in about 2 weeks. And
Are you kidding?
it just happened to be that on Friday, I said, oh, I've got Saturday morning free. I think I'm finally gonna check in on the Institute's practices. And it was only when I got on your website, like finally having a Saturday morning free, that I saw Jason was speaking today. So I'm just saying about like the synchronicity in line with the academic. That's all.
No, that's
fun.
great.
Thank
And
you.
Elle,
That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Great story.
and Elle's one before you log off. While you're doing this presentation, the general concept of the presentation, tell us just a bit more.
So this is a program, I mean, I think it's the only academic program in the world that has a pathway in studying religious experience. And I finished my master's research about 4 years ago, but I've stayed involved with the group. And I really love Jason taking on, Charles Taylor, and I'm a William James scholar. And so the whole idea of modernity, and anyway, I've lost my train of thought here. But my advisor has kept me involved with the program and with the current master students. I think she's hoping I will go on to do more work She also, I think, is very similar to your grandmother. She's a German anthropologist, has
Wow.
taught at Oxford. She studies spirit possession in Brazilian religions. Those are actually a little bit in contrast, though, with Pentecostalism in Brazil. There's an interesting dynamic going on. So anyway, there's just so much. But I'm trying to do a presentation without having read your books yet. So that's next.
Yeah, and I have a short article about William James, if that's of specific interest.
Oh, yes.
Because the alternate, I had two versions of the intro to this book, one of which started with William James and the other which started with Marie Curie. More people said, I tried it out on some colleagues and they were like, oh, we know about James, or we know James did some of this, but Marie Curie, that's a surprise. And anyway, it's good to start, as with a pioneering woman, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I published the James thing separately. And if you'd like, I'm happy to send you that. But it's about also the history of religious studies. I use James as a stepping off point for, in particular, theosophy and the history of religious studies. So that's, I make a slightly different point from the book, but it's more.
What can you say to our audience right now about James then?
Well, I mean, I think what people probably know about William James is that he did a lot of psychical research. He was also one of the people who did, pioneering psychologist and pragmatist philosopher, et cetera. He actually did some of the work with Palladino and others, but the thing that people might not know about James is that he was also a member of the Theosophical Society, at least briefly, and he had more openings to that. His father had been Swedenborgian, and he had more openness to that part of the world. James wrote a very influential book about religious experience, varieties of religious experience, which really defined the sort of psychology of religion for in many ways almost for 100 years in the Anglo-American world. So very influential figure. And anyway, I have a little piece that I've picked up from the archive in at Trinity College, Cambridge, that's his correspondence around theosophy. And I start with that and then go from there. But I'm interested in the discipline of religious studies and its stories about its own narrative in that particular article. But I'm happy to send you the link to that if you email me, or send you the article if you email me, or what have you. And thank you for yeah.
Thank you, Al. That's
good
really
luck.
very interesting.
What did you think about your experience with us the other day? Your first one.
Your posture experience?
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Cool.
But I've lost my rattle. I can't find it anywhere. So anyway.
It'll show up. Thank you. I want to talk to Brian. Appreciate it. I want to talk to Brian Tucker next.
Can I say one second before I go to Brian? I wanted to follow up on Elle's thing of doing a presentation of you and your grandmother. Those that were at the intersection of the work. Where do you see that? Because I know you have your own views, and she was very strong in her views. And no one's questioned where Felicitas stood.
And she was like the grandmother to all of us, right? She was the grandmother we never had, but wanted.
Stern and direct. So with that said, where do you see the overlapping? If you both, if we could bring her up on screen right now and you guys were sharing a presentation together, where would you overlap?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated. I mean, I end the book with actually talking about her and my experiences, talking, with her as a kid. But I would say where I give her something that she said that is a kind of, to my mind, version of the myth of disenchantment, which is a notion that horticulturalist peoples had a fully flourishing connection to spirit, to a kind of spiritual world, or at least alternate reality, in ways that moderns don't. And I try and complexify that a little bit. I would say what I think that she's right about is the importance of altered states of consciousness, and the idea that there are, that the consciousness has a lot more to it than ordinary experience can hold or fully define. And I personally, do trance stuff. I don't perform it. I never rattle, but my mother still does it. And so, and I find it personally, in a not deeply ontologized way, a source of great inspiration, and spiritual, meaning. But I don't think that, I think that her chronology isn't, we differ about chronologies, about the shape of history. And I think we also differ about, she wanted the trance studies to explain more things than I think one is capable of explaining. So for instance, when she did some work on Annalise Michel, who was a woman who thought she was possessed and had various issues. My grandmother wanted to describe that in terms of a kind of problem with a trance state, and I tend to tip more toward psychological explanations. But anyway, so we have our, I mean, have our differences there as well. But anyway,
Actually,
I think
you're right.
I think you're right. And
not everything she said holds up.
but talk about
But she has some
synchronicity.
good solid core.
But talk about synchronicity for Elle to have that presentation coming up and for her just to discover on Friday.
Just in time.
Brian. Yes.
I have to say, Brian was the first one that told us about your book.
Well, so what was synchronistic about that, Laura and Paul, is that you had a guest on your show, Dean Radin, and Dean mentioned specifically the Myth of Disenchantment, that he was reading it, that he recommended it. And when I got it, I was similarly enthused. I think it's a great, I love that body of work that you've done, Jason, and then discovered your relationship later as a grandson of Felicitas. I just wanted to say, in my experience, your grandmother's work, she left us a legacy to help guide us back towards an embodied experience of enchantment. Having practiced Zen Buddhism as well, I would say that the ritual body postures offer something in addition that I did not find in other areas of spiritual experience. So I find myself wondering about the frameworks that might lead us back towards a re-enchantment with the world. For example, I really love narratives coming out of science right now, although they are limited, but this cosmology that describes us within the multiverse, within a quantum experience. There's so many great metaphors that one can't help but find some bit of re-enchantment. But I find myself wondering, for you, where does re-enchantment live in your work? What's guiding you? What are your embodied experiences of re-enchantment? What frameworks do you think are useful these days in leading us back into that kind of experience of the sacredness of the world?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, this is, thank you very much for recommending the book and for encouraging us to read it. I would say I tend to be a little bit deflationary about re-enchantment because I want to suggest that the enchantment, it was never really gone there, and that there are multiple sources on offer. So in that respect, what looks like disenchantment is really pluralization, and, that people have very different and competing ways to find meaning in the world. And there are a lot of them, and it's very important for us to find the ones that work for us, but there are a lot of models on offer. And I agree with you though, Brian, that for me, Zen is really important, but I mean, the trance stuff is useful for me too. I find that, inspirational, perhaps less centrally than my mother, or for instance, or something, but it's still important to me. But yeah, I think that there are many different places to look for kinds of important sources of meaning. For me, I argue in the follow-up book to the Disenchantment book, my more recent book, which is this one, Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. I argue for a pursuit of a kind of human and multi-species flourishing as a way to produce a source of meaning. And for me, I think that the climate and is such an important issue, and our engagement with our multi-species environment is so important but anyway, I describe different kinds of sort of human flourishing. I don't use the language of re-enchantment in that book, but I do emphasize different sources for living a fuller life and a more meaningful life, which draws on a range of different traditions. Anyway, I call the end product revolutionary happiness as a short term for it, but there are various reasons.
I like that,
why.
revolutionary happiness.
Yeah,
I will
that's
say
great.
that we've been working with the anthropologist Christine and Kim Clark-Sharp on human flourishing with this work, with the work of the Cuyamungue Institute. So it's extraordinary to look at it and how much gratitude and compassion and joy and creativity and emotional resilience and just universal love comes up. Many different methods to reach it, but that state is so accessible to us. Brian, you have something to add on that too?
No, I just was going to say that just the value of the work that you're doing in dispelling this myth of disenchantment is so critical. So I really appreciate that. So
thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Georgette had some questions as well. Maybe we can get you on screen if you'd like to share your questions rather than me reading our chat room. There you are.
Yeah.
There you are.
Okay, hello everyone. So my question is I have issues applying the human form to where to go? I wrote it down, hold on. To God or deities.
Yeah.
I understand that since the Inquisition, the Middle Ages, we lost a lot of great knowledge, specifically coming out of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Is that knowledge still there? How do we extract it and redistribute this knowledge to the entire planet of people who still believe in deities? I feel as if it's a distraction to what our real priority should be, the earth. What are your thoughts?
Well, so I agree with the end of your statement that the earth is an important priority, and but the first part, so the Inquisition, I'm going to be really geeky and historian-ish about it. Sorry. The Inquisition wasn't really medieval. So the Inquisition is primarily an early modern phenomena. Starts in the 15th century, really. And it really picks up steam over the course of what we could call, called early modern period. Partially, and partially,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah. I think we lost a lot of knowledge when we started demonizing things that we didn't understand, witches and the paranormal and that sort of thing. It was a religious happening that happened in Europe, right?
Yeah, so there's this complex history. There is a complex history of demonization, and I think that's right. And I think that there was, as part of the colonization process in particular, a demonization of a whole range of indigenous practices and attempts to stamp those out. In some places, tragically, Europeans were successful. And so, but in other places, different indigenous groups had a kind of remarkable resilience and continued to believe in them in different kinds of things. But even so, those ideas tended to change. I think that it's, I don't want to, this is what the historian or the philosopher Boaventura de Sousa Santos describes epistemicide, which is the death of indigenous kinds of knowledge as part of a side effect of colonization. And I think that's a real tragedy. I don't know, there are different attempts to recover them. I think, my work hasn't so much been an attempt to, I'm not a leader in an indigenous community, but I do listen to my friends who are about the things that they think are important for us to recover. So, and some of those are rediscoveries. I think there's also a mistake to pin indigenous knowledges to the past, though. A lot of indigenous traditions evolve, and that's actually a good thing. So, right. I guess, there's something kind of dialogical that could happen. We could think of happening once we strip aside the demonization, regardless of the history of when that occurred and how that occurred. Yeah, but I don't know if I'm really giving you a satisfactory answer. There's some good stuff.
No, you did. You did. So it's just the question about deities and human form and why are we still doing that? I don't get that. I thought that human knowledge has risen above the fact that we're still trying to understand the world from our own perspective. That's the only thing that I'm saying. And yeah, I don't know. It's just something that I think about, being raised Catholic, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. And, revolting against the Catholic Church at a very young age, because I just didn't understand what they were saying to me, and I didn't believe it. And I think that there's things in the world, yes, that we do not understand. And I think that that's the channel that we should be going on. And I just, feel like deities.
Another challenge that I have, because you mentioned your religious upbringing, but yeah, the atrocities that have been committed in the name of religion, and look at the schoolyards that they're digging up in Canada, the bones of unnamed children that were abused and not cared for and thrown away, and they didn't tell the parents. These were Indigenous children that they grabbed from their parents and put in a school and abused. When we
I
were
mean,
in
my whole
France,
family
we
are still
were
Catholic, you know, they're still
Yeah.
practice
the
the
Catholic and the
Catholic.
Jesuit. When we were in France, we were looking at the cave art of the Paleolithic, but we passed one of the castles, the grand homes. Oh, let's go in. They have tours. In the lower floors, they had the instruments of torture. You know, if religion's going to lose ground, this is in part of it. How can you
Yeah.
endorse such cruelty? Yeah, so I can't get over that
I mean,
one.
I think that there's
Thank
been
you.
a
We
We
lot
have
of
to be
cruelty.
accountable for our
Yeah.
histories. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I think there's been a lot of cruelty in the name of different kinds of things. So if you look at the history of, for instance, capitalist corporations, I mean, why did we, you know, what was the
Thank you.
what was the source of British colonization in India? Was the British East India Company. It was
Right.
a quote unquote, you know, financially driven project originally, or, you know, but I mean, you know, and then there are horrible
Okay,
things sometimes done in the name of science, and horrible things sometimes done in the name of this, that, and the other thing. I mean, so I mean, I think that one of
Look
the
at
things.
the doctrine of manifest destiny, and how do we come over here and wipe out 90% of the population?
Oh,
of
I
the
mean, I think
continent?
colonization is horrible, but if you,
Yeah.
but there's a myth about, or a mistaken history about the American settlement, for instance. We foreground the Plymouth Bay colony because we want to tell a story that involves religious freedom, but the Virginia colony was earlier and it was a purely commercial and capitalist enterprise. And
Oh,
so
thank
one of
you.
the things that we
Yeah.
make a mistake is when we, you know, overly simplify the backstory. So I'm not denying that terrible things happen in the name of religion, but terrible things also happen in the name of commerce. Terrible things have happened in the name of a whole range of different things. One of the ironies is the capacity for people to embrace contradictions in ways that can be, you know, incredibly dangerous. So people being imprisoned in the name of freedom, for instance, you know, like we're just really like, you know, humans are quite good at coming up with ways to justify shutting
Yeah.
down compassion in the name of higher ideals, whatever those ideals are, whether those are profit or freedom or religion
Thank
or
you.
what have you.
Yeah.
So that's a shame, but that's why for all the more reason, it's important to focus on compassion and, you know,
And
anyway,
dissect our
yeah.
current beliefs and to look at them in full. And
Yeah.
yeah, because we can create the new myth, right? We are telling ourselves a new story for humanity. We are architecting our way forward. Let's do it consciously, I think is also the next step.
Amen. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for jumping in.
Yeah.
Interject. We appreciate it. Yeah. You wanted to share Shoshana's
Yeah, Shoshana says, you're welcome to say this, but you've written it in the chat. She says, I love Jason's way of describing what his research has revealed. I appreciate the precision and the complexity of his thinking. It's so refreshing to move away from grand generalities. I look forward to his books. Maybe Newton described the universe as a machine. I don't think Newton did. But if biology, not physics, has been the dominant science in the 17th century, would scientists have envisioned the universe as a living organism with all its diversity and patterns of change? Two interesting points. How did Newton? He was there to explore God's handiwork through the physical universe, right? Physics. So where did the concept, the universe as a machine, it had many parts for its and purpose behind it. There was a hidden agenda behind that. And now we see the universe as a living organism. That's a beautiful evolution of our worldview.
Yeah, so there are a couple great things there, and I like both the hypotheticals and the question here. So we get the machine metaphor, the machina mundi, so the machine world. It's a medieval metaphor. But the word machine meant something different. In its early formulation, it was connected to the notion of interwoven or interconnected.
Right.
It doesn't mean the metaphor. It's not yet a clock metaphor. It's a loom. So the metaphor, the early references to the machine world still have like an intimately interconnected world rather than an idea of a clockwork universe that you're
And that was
operating
before the
outside.
machine age as well.
Then it was
too.
right before the machine age. But and in Newton's specific work, he interestingly there's this presupposition that science has always been pro-natural, and that the category of the supernatural has been the special reservoir of faith. But in Newton's early work, actually, he posits and needs a concept of the supernatural. He did think the universe was a machine. He didn't invent that metaphor, but he did use mechanical metaphors. But for Newton, it was an immanent world in which God was constantly active. So in a set of letters, for instance, and I can give you a link to an article I've written about this called The Thin Line Between Religion and Science that I wrote for a popular publication. So Newton describes a once in one of his letters, he's asked, why doesn't everything collapse in on itself with the force of gravity? And he argues it's because of consistent divine intervention that causes the universe to have the structure that it does. So it was a presupposition of the importance of the supernatural. And by contrast, a little bit earlier text, the Malleus Maleficarum, I mentioned this because I contrast the two in the article, which is this text that launched the witchcraft persecution, denies the existence of the supernatural and argues that witches have their powers from spirits, but the spirits are specifically described as not miraculous, not wondrous. They're really actually just demons that are a kind of creature that live in the world and have certain kinds of properties to them. So you might presume, anyway, it's a crossing of the signals, which one gets associated with what.
Darn
The
those demons, they're holding up the universe, but man, they're demons. Yeah.
there are different ways. But the second part of the question I really love too, what would it have been like had biology been central as the metaphor? And that's something that's really important because
That's an interesting question, isn't it?
Shoshana's really right that it's physics, and particularly a version of Newtonian physics that ignores his letters and his occult interests and all these other things. That was a kind of mechanism that became dominant. Although in his own day, Newton is criticized for importing occult forces, because gravity, Leibniz famously criticizes him for granting action at a distance, which was against a kind of corpuscular mechanism promoted by Descartes and others. Anyway, too much detail. But it would have been interesting had biology had the same prestige. Instead, biology has to play catch up. All that said, though, there were some influential folks who thought about the world as in living terms. So famously, Spinoza, who argued for Deus sive natura, so God nature, a divine nature, what is often called pantheism. And there's a long history of pantheism in the Western context, imagining either a nature that is God, or sometimes a kind of nature that is alive with different kinds of consciousness, so panpsychism, and panpsychists. So this is the idea that behind matter is consciousness. Basically, there's some fundamental relationship between matter and consciousness, and that's been widespread at different points. William James and many of the pragmatists were panpsychists, for instance. So
what about Einstein's spooky effect at a distance and quantum entanglement?
Yeah, and so then there's a renewed interest in some of this stuff. So one of the interesting things that happens at the dawn of the the atomic age, let's say, is a renewed. This is the same period that people are really interested in occult traditions. There's a neo-pagan revival going on, and a turn toward Asian thought. And so a lot of early quantum physicists were interested in Asian thought precisely because of the way that they had difficulty conceptualizing quantum phenomena. So tragically, when Oppenheimer dropped the bomb and said, "I become death, the destroyer of the worlds," he's quoting the Bhagavad Gita because he was reading, him and his peers were reading works in quote unquote Indian mysticism. And so anyway, Einstein, anyway, separately, but anyway, that's sort of, there's a broader background there and cultural context. And I think that we still don't have. Yeah, I'm not a physicist, so I won't go take us too long into. Well, no, I'll save the detail for quantum physics. But there are interesting ways to read quantum physics.
All of this, right? There's interesting storylines that we can talk about. Talking about politics and religion, Tony has made quite a study of Jeanne d'Arc, and he's saying she was condemned by the Inquisition, but it was politically motivated. Have you looked into her life at all?
Yeah, right. She's a really famous an influential case study there. So she was condemned. She was condemned by an ecclesiastical court. It's not the same thing as the Inquisition exactly, but it is a ecclesiastical court. But it was in, as Tony accurately notes, in the period in which, for political reasons, basically. So part of this has to do with the history of the relationship between Great Britain, what we now call Great Britain, and France, basically. And to make a long story short, Jeanne d'Arc became famous in the first place because she backed one of the claimants for the French throne. This pissed off other French nobles who were allied with the British claim to the French monarchy. She first she becomes famous, she's wearing men's clothing. There's all these interesting things. She has misting visions. She wears men's clothing. Although interestingly, if you look at the trial transcripts, she's put on trial, and then they want to insist that she not wear men's clothing. You can see all this boundary of gender norms that they're policing as well. But she claimed to have divine visions that declared somebody king, and that also were prophetic. So she was seeing the future. And for a range of reasons, but I think you're right, we're in good part politically motivated. Especially because she got captured by the other side, basically, and they put her on trial in an ecclesiastical court. There was strong pressure on the ecclesiastical court to condemn her. They condemned her. She was burned as a heretic. And then you may or may not know this, but the charge of witchcraft didn't necessarily result in burning. That's heresy that involves burning. Witchcraft, maleficia, in medieval law, we were supposed to be hung, but if you were a heretic as well, then you would get burned. Anyway, so Joan d'Arc was treated as a heretic and was burned for those reasons. Where are we going with all this? Yeah, I mean, it was definitely politically motivated, I guess, if we want to, at least in part. And it had
so many of the myth makings, it seems, is. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What I understand happened at the end, she had recanted, but she was still in jail in Rouen. She bathed. They took away her women's clothes. They left only men's clothes. She had to put something on after she bathed. And then they said, you have gone back to your old wicked ways.
Wearing men's clothes.
And they condemned her and burned her within 2 days of that.
Oh.
So they set her up. Yeah, sounds like a setup.
Yeah.
So sorry.
Well, it's the quintessential one. That's what I've heard. Now, Jason may have more information than I do, but
I mean, it's been more than a decade since I looked at the stuff, and I know that there's a new book coming out by, there's a new book coming out about the trial and new trial records, but I'm totally blanking. Winifred Sullivan, is that right? Let me double check. Yeah, I think she has a new book coming out on it. Where and I saw her present on it a few years ago. But anyway, she's excavating some more interesting stuff about some of the details. But I can't now remember all the things that she's found. But I would keep your eye out for Winifred Sullivan. She's a faculty member at Indiana University, Bloomington. She's a historian of the law, and what she's interested in really is the legal precedents in and around the Jeanne d'Arc case. But I don't remember the detail. I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details. I remember some of the big picture from my earlier research, but I would anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tony, for
So
jumping in.
there's a statement that you make that the myth of disenchantment was necessary.
I don't think I say that exactly,
At
but
some
keep
point.
going.
How are you saying that? So
Hmm.
it was necessary for science to suppress enchantment at some point.
Some people said it was necessary, not
Oh.
me saying it was necessary.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm paraphrasing. I'm paraphrasing.
What's an
Adorno and
ideal
Horkheimer and
world? In
others.
an ideal world, where would you like to see this conundrum?
Which conundrum? I'm sorry, I
It's
didn't.
a
catch.
giant
Science and
picture.
spirituality.
Science and spirituality.
How do we unravel this?
Uh-huh.
And what's in an ideal world? How do we coexist with the two?
Uh-huh. Well, I think that they're not as incompatible as most practicing scientists. Have found different forms of meaning making in the world, whether you want to call that spirituality or religion or something else. And so I think that the presupposition of a dogmatic incompatibility between science and meaningful belief is inaccurate. That said, there are scientific arguments against certain specific beliefs, which people may or may not feel invested in. I think for me, one of the things, I think undoing some of the presuppositions of conflict, I think are useful. And I think also because there are religiously motivated actors who, because of presuppositions about, not wanting to change things in their beliefs over time, or presuming that science and religion are in conflict, want to mobilize, their religious authority to criticize science versus just as there are crusading atheists who want to mobilize scientific authority to criticize religion as such. And what I want to suggest is that, there are plurality of beliefs that people might have, but also science isn't a unity and neither is religion. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question or sort of like fudging in and around the area, but, it's a big
My
topic.
solution would be,
Yeah.
let's just expand our worldview, right? Let's just, in a collective sense,
Based on consciousness.
let's just agree science doesn't have all the answers. And I mean, we're
science is-
still run into yeah.
I think most attempts to use science as a unitary noun are probably not very good. So people say, science says, eat more cereal or whatever, but that's not a scientific orientation toward the category science itself. So I think what we end up having are a plurality of different theories, some of which are better or worse justified. Some of them are really we have a lot of evidence for, like evolution, for instance. But there are other things like string theory, for which my understanding is we don't have a lot of good evidence for it. In fact, famously, we have no direct experimental evidence for it, although there's some current research ongoing that people are arguing against it. So, I think rather than treating science as a unity in that artificial way, we need to think about beliefs and their capacity to change over time. I think that's
I
true.
guess, but
including
I'm also
scientific-
arguing for the fringe becoming mainstream, right? So rather than demonize, and I use that word loosely, a certain set of questions that we have and automatically relegating them to the fringe, we should have an open dialogue. For example, UFOs. When I started out in radio, you talk about UFOs and you're automatically fringe. Right now, there's a consortium of science now that is coming together in the Western countries that are saying, hey, we got to get together and research this. NASA has a UFO team that is now making public presentations. This has now become a legitimate area of inquiry. Why? Because the evidence is overwhelming that there's something going on. We don't know what. You don't want to.
It's military or it's this or that, whatever.
And it's a multiplicity of answers or data.
Right.
But I'm just saying that we should be able to talk about this. Wikipedia should not be demonizing, and I use that word loosely, Dean Radin for experimenting on areas of consciousness.
Let's make a correction
We
on
have this,
that.
yeah.
The way that Wikipedia works is that people get to add and comment, and so it's not Wikipedia itself that did.
Oh, no,
demonization.
no, ask him. He's saying there's a concerted effort to
Oh,
squash this
really?
kind of research
Okay.
and to make it fringe. I'm just saying if
That's
we
incorrect.
open up the dialogue,
Yeah.
that's why we say we're trying to move the dial through dialogue. We're trying to explore freely this world and
Yeah.
ask these questions. And that's why your grandmother, the founder of this institute, ran into a lot of roadblocks. That's why she was probably retired early from teaching. But good thing she went on to found an institute. But that's why she was presenting at a lot of conferences and academia. But she should have gotten farther in her heyday than she did, right? That's why I ask this question a lot. We're looking at some indigenous experience of the world. Scientists or researchers are looking at anthropology. They're looking at indigenous cultures, but they're saying, oh, it's very nice that you've experienced these things, these nice stories that you tell yourselves, but they're not looking at the validity of the experience.
Well, but that so
They're
has
not
a-
looking at the validity of the implications.
that's evolves.
Right. They're
especially since
sanitizing
Felicitas'
this.
day.
Oh, we see indigenous cultures and you have these
Mhm.
experiences. Look what her colleague, Erica Bourguignon did. She
Right.
put on the map that, hey, there's some validity to the fact that indigenous cultures say they have visions, they hear
Mm.
voices, they have these experiences, and they're legitimate. We just haven't gotten there yet to embrace the full measure of what it is to be human in our experience,
Mm.
in my opinion.
So I think that the trend in contemporary anthropology the pendulum has swung the other way, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
I think people are much more open to those than they were in my grandmother's day. And I think that's a good
Yes.
thing. Maybe I'll just end there and yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So-
Actually, Elle has her hand up again, so she probably wants to continue with a question. Here we go. Yeah, another question.
Well, actually, it's just a comment to add on to what Jason is saying about, and it's like letting go of the dichotomy that we're all carrying, that there is some science and religion conflict. Like the first thing that we do is within ourselves. And I think William James is an excellent example of being so relevant 120 years after his life, in that he wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience because he wanted to conduct a scientific study of religion. So that's on one side. He wants to do a scientific study. On the other side, we have his belief in spiritualism and seances. We have him quoting verses from the Bible when he went through a traumatic emotional time in his life. We also have his own personal religious experience in his night mountain journeying, communing with the earth gods. We also have his comments in his letters to his son that a driving need in him was to understand his relation to the universe. So on one side, he's got all of these spiritual and religious practices and ideas, and he still is saying he wants to conduct a scientific study of religion. Anyway, just a comment.
No, it's a good comment. Yeah. Jason?
Yeah, and then just to add one more to the list, because you've done such a good job of, but for other people also, then he wrote, the will to believe, which then, directly, or gave that as a set of lectures, which directly also pushes into these questions about belief and its value. But yeah, William James is great. Yeah, I spent a little bit of time with the pragmatists, but the one that I use most in the Metamodernism book is actually Peirce. But I'm not focusing so much on the category of religion, but on his accounts of meaning, basically, and semiotics, and then his notion of inference, basically. But anyway, that's another tangent that we can take another time.
Thank you. It's interesting too that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle famously believed in fairies and investigated fairies. And that's interesting. And I have to say that Paul and I were quite surprised when we invited John Matthews on, some British researchers, and he just talked about fairies and the sidhe and his personal direct experience with what he says was a fairy. That has got more views on our 100 interviews strong
I think it's number
Zoom
one.
channel
That's the number one.
than anything else. And that was surprising to us.
Yeah.
And I thought, interesting, and sometimes there's so many people that we've traveled through England a lot, and so you can have a conversation. People believe in this still. So you're right, people still believe in some of these. And it's just interesting to me that that is so prevalent still. But John told a really interesting story about it, and it's very, very popular.
And whether you want to put it in the category of mythology, it attracts people's attention. That's the reason why it's got the thousands and thousands of hits that it has.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of nuance,
right?
When you dissect the nuances, then
it's
it can get very interesting.
Yeah.
I have to say that I want to also, let me just say, I also find it interesting that those researchers that were attending seances and finding something credible there to intrigue them. I had a similar experience in radio, in our little radio studio. Uri Geller comes down to visit.
Oh, that's
Uri Geller's in town and offers to come to your show. And I'm like, yeah, come on into the studio. And so he proceeded to perform a few experiments to this day that we cannot explain, but we have our own eyewitness reports. So I guess my point is I can understand those scientists who were observing phenomenon that they cannot explain, right? Other people can explain it away and they try to do this and that, but Uri Geller holds up a key. Paul, let me show you key bending. He holds up the key. Describe what he did.
I think he just said bend, and
we saw the key do this.
He didn't do
bend.
anything with his hands.
It.
He just touched it and looked at it, and it just curled right over. It was just the oddest thing.
Just saying.
Yeah, I mean, so I was going to take what you've said in two different tangential directions that I'll be just doing historian things at, but I think you might find interesting. So to work backward, one of the most influential disabusers of belief in spirits was the magician Harry Houdini, who made it part of his life mission later to basically disenchant. And he also helped fund court challenges to the critique of spiritual mediums. He tried to expose false mediums. I mean, he was he became very motivated later in life So it's kind of ironic that perhaps one of the most famous magician in the sleight of hand senses of human history was doing a lot of disenchanting work. So, but the second thing that I was going to mention when you mentioned the fairy belief is that I have a chapter in the myth book about one of the constant tropes of fairy belief is that the fairies are supposed to be gone. So we have this already as far back as Chaucer, and arguably you can see anticipations of it in Plutarch and in others who don't use the word fairy. But the idea is that the fairies fairies are always sort of in the past, are supposed to be gone. People used to believe in fairies, says Chaucer, in the days of King Arthur, but nobody believes them anymore. And there are also folkloric accounts in the 18th century, for instance, of this idea of people seeing processions of fairies leaving the world or whatever. And so if you do folklore studies, one of the things that folks do in folklore studies is track repeated folk thema. There's a particular typology called of repeated folk themes, and one of the most widespread is a kind of fairy farewell. So this idea that fairy belief is in the past is one of the central features of fairy belief, you could argue. Often that's one of it means to be, defined as a fairy belief, at least since that term begins to take on a certain kind of autonomy. And similarly, there's a repeated trope about magic, which is often located in the past. So many spell books begin with magic is otherwise gone, but here in this spell book, I'm going to bring it back. Or, there are fantasy novels that do the same thing. George R.R. Martin had a version of this trope in one of the early Game of Thrones books. Magic is once gone, but will now return. There are a lot of examples of that. And so if you want to look at what is the first iteration of the myth of disenchantment, depending on how you define it, I argue that it's embedded in early tropes of magic. And so it is itself one of the themes that goes along with early notions of quote unquote magic. Anyway, there's a chapter where I look at how one of the earliest founders of folklore studies, George Fraser, is one of the people who coins an early version of the myth of disenchantment that becomes influential on Weber, but he gets it from his own folkloric material. He's reading fairy tales about how people used to believe in fairies, but they don't anymore. And so in a way, I argue that the notion, this myth anyway, goes back quite far, arguably. And it goes back into periods where nobody thinks that when people still think fairy belief was incredibly widespread, people still have the trope that fairy belief is itself in the past, or that the fairies themselves used to be around a lot, but are now gone. Anyway, that's a tangent. It doesn't get to some of your larger points, but yeah.
I'm not surprised that a magician would disabuse one of the notion of actual magic, because their whole career is based on creating that illusion with a mechanistic way or through their sleight of hand, right? So they're seeing the mechanics of how easy it is to create that illusion. But I think that's also what enchants people, why people are love to witness magic shows.
Okay, but part of it is shifting definitions of the word magic. So in the late medieval period, things that we might think of as technologies were often included under the subheading of magic. So works of natural magic, for instance, famously included things that we would now call early engineering, and gunpowder, for instance, was considered quote unquote magic. Then in the 18th century, we start to have a split where some people who, especially starting in Paris and then through Britain and globalizing, on the one hand, we have people who are calling themselves magicians, but who are doing stage magic, using kind of mechanical contrivance and that meaning of the word magic. And then we have a bifurcation of people who, in roughly the same period, begin to think about magic in a less mechanical way, who start to think of magic as a more spiritual kind of practice. And this is where Aleister Crowley tacks a K onto his version of the word magic to distinguish it from stage magic. But those originally had one history, and they depart and converge at some points and depart at others. So in one way, if you look back at what medieval Europeans were calling magic, it would have included both mechanical things and things under which the action was supposed to have been performed by a demon or an angel or what have you. So anyway, that again, part of the differentiation of religion and science has its effect on the shift in the meanings of the word magic. And then Houdini, concretely, he said in his autobiography that he was actually really fascinated by spiritualism, and that it was he went into it thinking that it was perhaps a real phenomena. He was a big collector of books of both natural magic and of occult magic, but he went to a particular seance, and the person doing it, he could see was faking it so much that it pissed him off. And then he was like, if this person's faking it, they're all got to be faking it. And then he went around showing all these other, examples of faking it. But, there's a little hesitation that he has in one of his later letters where he's like, well, he's either joking or not, but he famously tells his wife, if it turns out there really is a spirit world, or this is what she reports, it's actually not in a letter, but anyway, I will contact you after the dead. And so then, he's kind of not finally closed the door when he dies, perhaps. It's not something I've done deep research on, but anyway, that's part of the,
You mentioned angels, and I would suggest that maybe everybody, or one of the largest percentages of people believing in alternate phenomenon, angels might be right up there.
In contemporary US, yes, less so in other parts of the world.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, right. Anyway.
What is your new work? What are you working on currently?
Well, so I've got one more book past the book that one. So I've got 3 books out now. These 3 that I'll show you. But right now I'm working on something that's mostly going to be appealing to, so the Invention of Religion in Japan, the Myth of Disenchantment, and then Metamodernism, the Future of Theory. But the book I'm finishing now is a narrow academic work that I'm just trying to finish because it's about history and philosophy and how they fit together. That's the easiest version of it. And it engages with some key influential figures in the history of philosophy, particularly Nietzsche and Foucault. And it's an attempt to make to have a different discussion about how we narrate the past, how we ethically judge or don't judge the past, how much the past actually impinges on the present. But it's a short book. I'm in the kind of late phases of it. But I'm going to be on sabbatical this next year. I'll be at Leipzig Universität in Germany in the fall, and then I'll be at Harvard in the spring. And at that time, I'm hoping to have this book done first. But I bought myself time to kind of come up with another project. But I'm not sure where it's going to go.
And when you're teaching, what is your favorite class to teach? What do you most want your students to walk away with?
I don't know. I'm a little bit of a freak because I like changing the classes that I teach. Other colleagues like to reteach the same classes, and I have to do that somewhat for, they have to check certain boxes, but I like to teach new classes all the time. What I love to teach most is what I'm researching and what I'm really passionate about at a current moment. I just taught a course called What is Power, which is an attempt to think about what people mean by power and produce a theory of power, and related to theories of causation and philosophy of science. So it's social science theories of power, but also what would a cause be? What do we mean by causation? Anyway, abstract philosophical stuff. I enjoy that one very much, but really, I teach a whole range of courses, and I'm always evolving into new things. I think I may teach a course next when I return from sabbatical on the notion of monstrosity and how where that comes from, and in a sort of history of science way, the idea that there are certain things that are monstrosities, but also anyway, that's something that I'm interested in thinking about. Not necessarily in terms of my writing, but I know I'll get kids in the room and have fun conversations with them if I put the word monstrosity or monsters in the title of something. But yeah, so I'll kind of all over the place. But I like these deep ideas. I taught a very successful course on the concept of social construction, because that phrase is bandied around all over the place. And undergraduates often think that the great insight of their undergraduate career is to learn that X, Y, or Z is socially constructed. And then you might try and push the boundaries of that or think, what do we mean by social construction? And this was while I was writing the Metamodernism book, where I try and answer what social construction is. So if you want to know that, you can look at that book too.
So you have a young daughter, and you
That's
say
right.
that speaking multiple languages as a child helps one become adept at learning languages. Are you speaking bilingually around her? How are you exposing her to multiple languages? How old is she?
Yeah, she's 4. And so 4.5, I guess now. So far, we were kind of too inconsistent because she was born shortly before the pandemic, basically. And so we had all of these great ideas about what we would do, and then ended up spending, a whole year where I was teaching out of here, and my wife was here too, and she was here, and we had a occasional babysitter coming in, but not very much. outside. So that was very challenging. But what we are doing is for the first half of this coming sabbatical this fall, we're going to Germany and we're putting her in a German kindergarten. And so she'll be getting firsthand German in her ears at least. And I hope that will, I think she's still in that sensitive window. It'll be really good for her. But we didn't also have the opportunity to put her in a bilingual education. I was lucky in that where I grew up, it was possible. It was so important to my family that I be bilingual that they hunted around for anything. And I ended up going to a French school. So I grew up with English and French as my two languages, initial languages, and then, learned a lot of other things along the way. Yeah. But I think but there's nothing like that exactly in the geography that me and my wife live in now. We live on the Vermont border in the woods, which is lovely and rural, but doesn't have as many pedagogical opportunities as I had. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
the other thing is that with the challenges that we're facing, the humanity shifting so dramatically and so fast, and technology shifting and AI and all the things that are going on, and bringing up a child and being able to see her future and being optimistic about what changes need to happen for her to have the productive life that your grandmother and your mother and yourself have had. What are your hopes and prayers for that as well?
Yeah, it's important to me. And partially the third book, the Metamodernism book, was written in a way inspired by her birth and her being around. I also recently just completed a whole thing on the question of utopia. One of the things that I've been trying to do is, and this was a college-wide initiative rather than a book or anything like that. But what I noted was that we were living through what really felt like dystopian times with the pandemic and anthropogenic climate change, with various forms of visible inequality that even were exacerbated by the pandemic, and concerns about racial justice and gender and all these things that were really bubbling to the surface. And what I wanted to suggest was that yes, there are things about our moment that look downright dystopian, but that's all the more reason why we might need utopian vision. And in particular, I'm playing on the term utopia. Etymologically, utopia with a U means nowhere. It's a joke when Thomas More coined it, but e-utopia means a kind of good place. And what I wanted to do, and I promoted at the college, was a plurality of different ways to envision better possible futures. And I enlisted colleagues of mine because I didn't have one agenda. I'm not like, oh, I have it all figured out. We all need to just do this one thing and everything will be dandy. But I wanted to encourage and scatter these more utopian seeds. So I got colleagues of mine at a range of different disciplines. A colleague of mine who's one of the few Indigenous faculty members to teach on Indigenous utopias. Another friend of mine whose specialty, who taught on Afrofuturistic utopias, another friend who taught on queer utopias, another friend who in the environmental studies who talked about environmental justice, and then a friend in the English department who talked about utopian literature. Anyway, we did all these utopian programming, not the idea that we were going to give one answer to our students, but just to encourage in them the kind of ideas that might be directed toward envisioning better and brighter futures, even on the other side of struggle. And then I taught a course myself called Realizing Utopias, where I had students design and imagine different kinds of positive utopian communities, from planets to communes and anything in between they wanted to imagine. And then I introduced little bits of realism to them and issues that they would have to deal with. And then they had fun trying to deal with them. It had a kind of, it was a very student directive, project oriented class. I think they had a lot of fun. And then we exhibited stuff at the library, and it was a bit of a blast, but it was a 3-year project. I had a 3-year grant to encourage utopian conversations on campus. This is a non-answer. I don't know where we need to go exactly, but I do know that
that's not a non-answer. That's good.
Yeah.
No, that was a good
to be able to
follow-up.
envision something. Yeah, for
No,
sure.
actually, in talking about that, I know there's that one interview with your grandmother where she was asked the question about people coming together with intentional communities and how they can survive with a shared thing. And she said they always seem to fail. And that's because they don't have a shared
Vision.
It comes down to consciousness. It comes down to something that integrates people together. And maybe that's as a civilization, as humanity, maybe that's an answer. I know
Maybe we
we've
can all
been-
come together.
we've been
Yeah.
having several discussions with organizations that are focused on global consciousness, that concept of global consciousness and its effects, and maybe coming back to your daughter and the future, and having a vision for the future as well. Maybe that's part of that equation that has to be more fully focused on is that we can debate and talk and discuss things all day long intellectually, but if there's not a shift in the general consciousness of humanity, we
And if we don't promote human flourishing,
right.
right, we won't have the wherewithal to create the
No.
world we want.
Yeah, so partially, I really encourage human flourishing, and I do think it's really important for certain kinds of shifts. And then the other side, I'm also a committed epistemic pluralist. I think one mistake, and maybe this gets back to something that Laura was saying at a little earlier, is that we do often do too much attempting to make everybody have the same beliefs. And I think we can also handle it. So we both want to encourage a broader shift in certain areas, a shared project, perhaps, or shared, certain things that we might want to do, better epistemic norms
Let
around
me tell you
making
how
decisions. But I'm a pluralist in a fundamental way. So I fully
We're
want
a
to celebrate.
generalist as well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
my father used to say, don't believe it just because you see it in black and white. If you see it in print, it doesn't make it true. Ask questions, make up your own mind. So that was something my father always encouraged, is question everything.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and I really truly believe that each of us, it's a sacred task to find our worldview, to keep exploring.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the my favorite stories is when you look at the pundits of the day when the Wright brothers were inventing the airplanes,
Right.
and they were saying mechanical powered flight is impossible. We know everything. We've got the physics of the day. We're declaring it impossible. And there they were
The science of
taking off in a mechanical device. They hadn't yet formulated the concept of lift, as
Yeah.
we know that can
Phenomena.
happen.
Yeah.
But they were saying, we've discovered everything. There's no more to be discovered. And when we, so we have to question everything,
Mhm.
don't we? We really, the Big Bang theory is still a theory, right? So I agree that it's a pluralistic universe, and easy answers are dangerous to accept readily. So,
And that's why, and part of the fun in this organization is looking back to the past and having respect for the indigenous wisdom of all the cultures around the planet. And all of us have indigenous roots, of course, and seeing what
Maybe
did,
they'll
what did we learn?
survival.
Don't just dismiss it just because it happened then. Let's see what general integration of humanity was happening without all the distractions, when they were just sitting under the stars and doing things in a simplistic way. Maybe there's some wisdom there that we need to return back to.
that we need to pull forward.
and integrate it more. Yeah, exactly. Well, this has really been a fun and exciting conversation.
Thank you for all the dissection
Yeah,
that you've
we-
been doing.
Finally
our
met someone
beliefs.
who speaks faster than me, and that's fascinating and fun. And definitely impressed, Jason, with you and all the work that you're doing. And of course, like I said before, I know that your grandmother must be extremely proud of where you've gone and of what you're accomplishing, and the way that you're conducting your life. So with that said,
thank you all, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for carrying on her mission. I mean, it's really great, that you're doing such important work and bringing in all these different interesting folks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah.
all right, take care. Have a
right.
wonderful, peaceful, healing day. All right.